The other day, I had the privilege to get to sit down and interview somebody that I really enjoy watching his videos on YouTube, Sifu Brian Kuttel. And if you've not watched his Kung Fu and Tai Chi videos, I highly recommend checking them out. He has so much information for martial arts, but also for just brain development in general. And I think if you get the opportunity to watch his videos, you're going to learn an awful lot. This is the third interview I've had with him, but unfortunately, the first two interviews, I had glitches with my equipment and I wasn't able to record them as well as I wanted to. But in this interview, we talk about a whole bunch of topics from ambidexterity to brain development to old age and martial arts to strength train. I think there was a little bit of strength training in there. I mean, Brian just knows so much when it comes to martial arts, and he's an excellent teacher that has a really good track record with his own students. And so I think you're going to really enjoy this interview. And I'm hoping to have more interviews like this on the channel. I've kind of neglected this channel for a while, and I'm hoping to kind of add some more content that will be really good conversations that can maybe help you with your searching for brain development and ambidexterity. So enjoy this. And hey, welcome to the Academy of Renaissance Thinking, and I'm here with my friend Sifu Brian Kuttel, and we're going to talk about ambidexterity again. This is actually the third video that we've made, and I can tell just by looking at everything that everything is recording well. But the other two videos, there's always been some kind of strange glitch that happened. So, yeah, the last one was great. There's a really good interview of you, but you can't hear any of my questions. So it's like for some reason my mic wasn't working or something. But this time I'm getting level on everything, so
Oh, good.
it should be good. Anyway, tell our viewers. Well, first of all, I found you because I really like two sword wielding techniques. And so, about 7 years ago or so, I was doing research on different dual wielding techniques from around the world. And at the time, you had so many good videos, and now you have so many more really good videos and playlists. And it's kind of like I was thinking about yesterday. I was walking my dog, and I was thinking about how much I've learned from your videos, and it's like I don't think I've ever lived anywhere where there was a halfway decent kung fu school. And it's like, but because of your videos, I've been able to add some really good kung fu techniques into my own martial arts practice. And it's just like we live in such a cool time that I told one of my students the other day, I was like, you're almost at a point where anything you want to learn, you can learn it on YouTube if you know how to learn. And that's really the key is whenever you learn anything, whether it's guitar or piano or a martial art or whatever, you can have a teacher that's going to tell you what you need to learn. But if you're not learning, if you don't know how to learn yourself, you're not really going to get any benefit from it.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
know, and a student has to be willing to put in the energy and the effort to want to internalize the information, or they're just not going to get anywhere. I think the advantage of having a teacher is that the teacher will guide you through the process to make it easier so that you're building on foundations that build off of each other. But if you've already got I guess a pedagogy of how your brain works and how you learn, then yeah, you definitely could cherry pick the internet and come up with really good information. So it's beautiful because even somebody way out in the middle of the Midwest like I was as a kid, with no one around to study what you want to learn, it's out there and you can learn it. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, that's kind of the basis for everything that I've been, putting up online is looking back towards what did I want when I was young and wanted to learn and just be a sponge and soak in as much as I could, and get all these things from martial arts because I personally have been lucky to have been able to study where I was able to study and learn the style that I was able to learn. But I remember scouring, like chat rooms and forums
Mm-hmm.
just to find little bits and pieces of information. And I had books and videos, and you just dissect everything that you could. But I mean, now it's like you said, so readily available, and I am happy to be contributing to that.
Have you ever got? I don't know that you probably would have. I remember back when I was younger, like in the late '70s and the early '80s, there would have been some. If something like YouTube existed, there may have been kickback from some of the older teachers of, why are you sharing our secrets, to the world? Has anybody in this day and age ever given you any kind of grief
Yeah, a
about
little
that?
bit. Yeah,
Really? Oh,
actually, yeah.
wow.
It's mostly the like the system that I study and that I teach is a forms based system, and
Okay.
one of the things that they consider proprietary information or even trade secrets, if you want to call it that, is having these certain forms.
Mm-hmm.
So I think my teacher, my Sifu, ran into it years ago. He went to a tournament, and there was somebody that came up to him that he had no idea who they were, and they said, "Oh, hey, it's you." It's my Sifu is Jason Wong, the son of Grandmaster
Okay.
Dr. Fai Wong. And they're like, "Oh, Sifu Wong, it's nice to meet you." And he's like, "Oh yeah, cool." And they're like, "I learned this form Sibui Fa from you." And he's like, "I don't remember teaching you." And they're like, "Oh no, I." We took a video of you performing before at this tournament, and we learned it from that. And from that point on, he became very, very strict. And that was when he was young, way before I was
Wow.
learning from him. So it became a thing, like a basic, just a rule of thumb in our federation that if you are competing in a tournament, or if you're performing for a demonstration, or if you're making a video like what I do, to edit chunks out of the form. So it's never the
Really?
entire form, unless it is something that is very, very common knowledge. So there are a couple of forms that are
Wow.
out there that, different lineages, different styles, easily recognizable. But for a lot of the stuff, I take out a couple of combinations, or I'll do some
Wow.
camera changes and some things for that. So
Well, it makes me like I'm the type of person that if I was under a restriction like that, I would probably start inventing my own forms, you
yeah,
know?
it's so. I mean, you get creative with what you do.
Yeah.
It's for the most part, though, I if I feel that it might be on the edge of whether they would like it or not. I mean, I'm in close contact with my Sifu and my grandmasters, so I usually
So
just
you
check with them first, and I'll say, "Hey, is this okay?" And then if they say no, that's too much, then I'll edit it something
take
out.
it
But
out.
you
Huh.
you can make like artful adjustments, just total form rearrangements and things like that, and you're not revealing much of anything. But I
Hmm.
do. I actually have, as far as teaching wise, I have created some forms myself for my online program, rather than having students go through, because that's another thing that we have kind of a little bit of a strictness about, is that you want to make sure that students have that progression as the
Yeah.
standard curriculum. So if they, I know people want to learn some weapons and they want to learn some forms and stuff, and if they're just doing it for general knowledge or for having fun, then I've made some short forms available, and then also it works with the techniques being taught. So I have
Hmm.
done some of that, but you get creative. And it's kind of funny because now that you mention all of that too, the thought process that I've always had is that I personally don't mind doing the edit. That's not a big deal. Like I said, you can be creative. But even when the form is not edited, for somebody to watch the video and to learn the form from the video, it really depends on the person how well they're going to let the techniques sink in. If they're just
Mm-hmm.
copying it for something to do and they do it, how long are they going to remember it? How long are they going to value it? And a lot
Exactly.
of people can't even copy it correctly. So there's still
Mm-hmm.
going to be a skill issue than if you actually learned it from an instructor. So I feel like there's still a lot of, you know, there, like I can see it too when I watch some people, and they do movements that they've copied from one of my videos or even from another instructor. For me, it's pretty obvious that they don't know the form itself. They have some shapes, but it's just hollow. There's no
Mm-hmm.
substance behind it. And I know sometimes some people are very physically capable, so it could be pretty convincing that they do know what or it convince people that any audience that's not sure, they may look like they do know what they're doing, but they're just mimicking and copying. So there's
Well,
always some gray area there.
I kind of feel like with with the with anything, the whole improvise, adapt, and overcome motto sort of becomes sort of critical. And so, if you're studying somebody else's form, you could get some benefit out of it if you were with a teacher learning it, but you also could say, oh, wait a minute, I kind of see what they're doing there, and I could adapt that this way to where it would work with what I'm doing.
Yeah.
And so it's almost like, and sometimes that's a conscious thing that people do, and sometimes it's a subconscious thing where they don't even realize that they're doing it, but they do it. And I see it all the time with a lot of my guitar students. I have some guitar students that they're just like so focused, and I'll do something with like my picking hand, and then they'll come back like a week later and it'll be exactly like they took a video of it or whatever, and they'll be mimicking me exactly. And I was like, I wasn't even really, that wasn't what we were talking about. We were talking about what I was doing with this hand. But it's interesting that they fine-tuned in so much to that became what they took away from it. But then I have other students that they're like, oh, I'm still going to pick the way that I tend to pick, and but I'm going to put, do this that you showed me. And so it's kind of like, if you get the job done when it's all said and done, then to me I'm like, hey, you're playing the guitar. That's kind of a good thing. I think in martial arts, the only caveat that I would put to that is certain techniques, if you don't know what you're doing, you might break a bone or something.
Yeah,
You could hurt yourself.
yeah, you'll either hurt yourself or it just won't be effective. If you don't,
Exactly.
you could have a false sense of whatever you want to call it, power, or a false sense of being able to do something, and then in a moment's notice you're going to end up injuring yourself, or you're just
Yep.
going to render it just powerless. It has nothing behind it. So
Well, that's
I
why.
mean, that's something too, though. Like as far as forms are concerned, it's a choreography, it's a routine. But when it comes down to, I think, more important, and as far as sharing things martial arts wise online, are the concepts and the principles and the tactics, because those can be employed into somebody else's
Mm-hmm.
art without changing the art or without having to mimic somebody else.
Mm.
And I think that's more important than the actual, if you teach a technique and then you teach the why behind it, that's important. But if somebody just watches a demonstration of a form, they're not going to learn what's going on unless there's some
No.
kind of explanation of the principles, tactics, or concepts. And that's not to
Well, and
say that martial arts is super complicated. If you see a punch up towards the head, then you're
it's
punching
going to be a
somebody in the
punch.
head.
Yeah.
But the angle or the hip position or the way that you use your stance, the way that you set it up, the way that you follow up, those are important elements that are being missed by just watching and mimicking.
Well, and I think it was last time we had talked about combinations and
Yeah.
how a combination basically the repetition of it, the more you do it, the better chance you have of it actually being effective. In a situation, if you're actually in a combat situation, And it's kind of like your brain. I remember one time, um, I don't know if I told you this story, but my wife and I were walking through the parking lot, and I tripped and went into a forward roll and came up, and she was like, "How did you do that?" And we'd been married for like over 20 years at that point, and I was like, "I don't know, it's just that's what we would do in martial arts." It just came back to me, and she's like, "Are you okay?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I'm not hurt." And it's like you do something over and over and over, and it just becomes muscle memory at
Yeah.
that point, and it becomes part of your way of thinking and your way of reacting. And I think that kind of goes to something that I wanted to talk about today too, is speed development, because it seems like everybody, when you talk about martial arts, are like, I want to be so fast, I want to be like Bruce Lee. And it's like, okay, that's fine, but if you be like Bruce Lee at the beginning, and I have this with like piano students, I'll play something on the piano, and then the kid will sit there and just and make a bunch of noise, but they're getting the speed down, and I'm like, why is it that everybody wants to start with speed and not with technique? It's just it's what we want to do, but people don't realize that speed is not something that you naturally come up with. It's a result of doing something slowly over and over and over. And what I wanted to ask you about is, how does that how does speed and ambidexterity kind of fit together, I guess.
I think you've already kind of hit the nail on the head right there with just making sure that there's been the repetition. But I think the we have a saying that I mean it's not just our saying, but there is a saying that goes, slow makes smooth, smooth makes fast.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's where a lot of people, they do try to jump ahead and try to do things really fast. And in speed, you can kind of mask a lot of mistakes. When you're trying to
Mm-hmm.
reach a hand out fast for a punch, if it doesn't have that correct path, that alignment, it's not going to be a strong punch. But if you end up
Mm-hmm.
in that last position, oh, you got there, wow, that's so fast. But you're really cheating a lot of things. So going through things slowly, and it doesn't have to be like a Tai-Chi super slow speed, but going
Right.
through things at like at a pace where you can move the body correctly and still be able to identify all of the key elements along the way is really important. But to be able to, I mean, we see this especially, yeah, when it comes to the opposite side, our non-dominant hand or non-dominant leg, and I think there's something really interesting about it too, because we can develop more comfort with the motion in just repetition of it. You may feel a little bit slower at first in your non-dominant side, but I think one of the things that I found very interesting has been kind of more so in kicking, because our hands we tend to use a
Oh,
lot.
okay.
But when one of the things that I've noticed with a lot of students and even with myself is that I will have one leg that is more powerful when kicking, while
Mm-hmm.
the other one is actually faster. And when
Oh,
you're
that's
doing something,
interesting.
yeah, when you're doing some physical motion, you have muscles that are going to be, like when we do a punch, it doesn't mean all your muscles in your arm have to be tense for this. They don't all have to contract. Some have to activate, while others need to relax. Otherwise, it's like
Mm-hmm.
hitting the gas and the brakes at the same time. You
At
have
the
to push
same
and
time,
pull.
yeah.
So sometimes when we don't have the coordination, and I've noticed that the non-dominant leg tends to be the faster leg, tends to be a little bit more
Mm.
flexible too. Those kicks tend to be higher, and it's not it's not the all-encompassing. That's not set in stone, but many times that's the case, and it's because with the dominant leg, they put so much effort into power. They already have the coordination that sometimes they just do too much and it slows them down. It lowers
Mm.
that kick height. It doesn't allow them. They're contracting the muscle so much that it doesn't allow them the flexibility to actually kick high. Whereas the other leg, it'll be a little bit out of control, but it'll move faster and it'll kick higher because
That's
they
interesting.
they're just they don't have they're focusing so much on trying to just get the leg up and to kick that they don't
Right.
have everything going on for the fine details in it. And I've noticed
Hmm.
even over time, there's an interesting thing about having. I know for myself, there's my right leg is going to be way more powerful. It's going to be much stronger when I kick, but my left leg is always kicking faster. It just has that faster timing to snap. And
Well, and there's a use for that. Like I think at one point we talked about when I studied. I had a teacher that was one of Bruce Lee's students, and he was teaching me chain punching and the Wing Chun chain punching, and his whole point was um, you're not going to hit somebody powerfully with a chain punch. But what you're going to do is you're going to knock them off balance because they're not used to that flurry of punches. And the whole point was he was saying you have to learn to your arm is like a whip and it doesn't actually tighten up until you get to the end of the punch, and it works that way with both arms, and so in that case you're trying to teach your dominant. And what I found was I'm left-handed predominantly. I mean, I'm pretty ambidextrous, but my power is on my left, and it was like I always wanted to hit hard with my left, but I had to learn how to make it more whip-like to match my right hand, so you could get the speed down. And it's like that I never noticed my legs are pretty equally balanced. And I remember like in school we'd play kickball and it was like the I could switch with either leg, to kick with it, and it wasn't like there was a difference. But with my arms, there's really a big difference in even the way that I approach the techniques. And I think that that's one of the things that I liked about learning the Sinawalis from Filipino martial arts was it kind of taught both my arms to kind of meet in the middle a little bit better. And one of the things, somewhere on this channel, there's a chart that I made that I think people can still download, that basically it goes into teaching you how to make your own combinations. So it basically is like you have I think it's up to 12 different attacks with it. It gives you the right side versus the left side, and you can kind of go through that's color coded, so you can work through about which side you want to work with. You can add on if there's any additional cuts, like you're adding, like if it's a figure eight that you're adding on, or a tornado cut or something like that. And then down at the bottom, it even has a bit of drum uh, tablature so that you could write out the rhythm if you want to change what the rhythm should be on it. And I feel like that's one of the things that, as a musician and a martial artist, I don't think martial artists necessarily think about is the rhythm of how the sequences are supposed to work. And a lot of times it's like, well, this is just the rhythm that I've learned in the sequence. But it's like when you're in combat with somebody, they may be faster or slower than you, and really the way to win is to get them off of their rhythm.
exactly.
And as a musician, what I've found, the easiest way to get somebody off rhythm is to change the time signature. So like if you're like the Beatles did this all the time. So like if you listen to Here Comes the Sun, it's one, two, three, here comes the sun, but there's a da 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 da, and then it's back into the 4/4 time, and it's like, well, if you're imagining, and a lot of times when I was in sparring situations, I would in my head be singing like a Beatles song or a song that I knew changed time, and then when I got to that part where the time changed, I always won because they weren't expecting the time to change like that. And it was like, that's kind of why I added that down to the bottom of my little chart that I made, because it's like, that's a technique that you don't. I've never ever heard a martial artist talk about that. I've heard boxers talk about rushing,
Mm.
and I've heard some martial arts talk about rushing your footwork and things like that. But it's like, yeah, but that's not really explaining anything. But if you're talking about time change, now you're getting down to the mathematics of how to rush,
Yeah.
or how to slow down and change it up. And it's not hard to learn. Just listen to the Beatles or Sting or somebody like that, and you're gonna learn how to do it.
But it is absolutely true. We do get into a rhythm when we're fighting and sparring, and a lot of times too, people will just constantly, they'll go back and forth, right to left, and that's where you find a lot of that natural rhythm. So once, and of course, we naturally like to sink into that, right? We'll sync
Mm-hmm.
up with it. So when you change that rhythm, that definitely throws them off. When you take control and then
Yeah.
go into the 4/4 timing.
I think I think another thing, if we're going to go down that path a little bit, is also syncopation. And so, there's somewhere on the internet a video where somebody plays some of Jimi Hendrix songs with syncopation and then without syncopation.
Mhm.
And it's so completely and utterly different. And so it's like, I just recommend for any martial artist, learning an instrument is definitely going to improve your martial arts skills. And I think Musashi talked about that because he took up, I think it was the shamisen and then poetry and painting later on in his life, and in one of his books he talked about how that, if it actually affected his sword fighting and the way that he taught from then on. So
You
it's
know,
like,
that's interesting because I do know they have a very similar. They do have some records similarly in the Chinese martial arts. I mean, like war arts too, where there was an emphasis on more than just learning how to fight, but having similarly, I believe, poetry and either calligraphy and music, I think too. But there is a book, and I have to now, like, I have to dig it up because it it's back
I
there
got you
now.
thinking now.
But there is a book this woman martial artist wrote, and she talks about rituals for martial arts, and
Mm,
it's pre-battle, or and I mean battle, like battling arts, not just like hand-to-hand
okay.
karate or kung fu combat like that, like we usually associate with modern times martial arts, but predating that to warrior arts, and how
Okay.
they had rituals before and after combat and conflict. And it was a way to not necessarily just psych them up, but also to help them process everything on the inside so that they could be
Mm-hmm.
focused in the task. And then following it up, process it to be able to release emotionally through ritual.
This
And
is this is PTSD therapy before we knew about PTSD.
exactly, yeah, yeah,
And even in European martial arts they had that, like the a lot of the chivalric codes talk about, how you should study poetry or music or dance or something outside of it. And so the knights were not just studying combat
yeah,
all the time. They had these other things going on too. And these are ways to, like, I have a buddy that he was a soldier, and he's been in some pretty bad combat situations, and he's also a pretty high level martial artist. And um and music is kind of his way of dealing with a lot of the PTSD that he's had. And it's one of those things that people don't realize just how much stress your body goes and endures when you're into a situation like that. And it's not just combat. I mean, a car wreck, somebody attacking you on the street and making you feel helpless, even a really bad argument with people close to you or something like
100%.
that. All those things can combine. Or like I knew another guy, he was a chaplain, and he ended up with what they call double PTSD because before he was a chaplain, he was an infantry guy, and he had his own PTSD that he was
Right.
dealing with. But then as he was counseling all these other soldiers, it was compounding his own PTSD, listening to all what they went through, and it's like, just helping people through that can be
That's
something that can affect you. And like I asked him, and he said, well, my dog, he got a PTSD therapy dog, and he said my dog has been helping me a lot. And he said whenever he was, he's a chaplain, so he's like, whenever I need to pray about something, my dog can sense it, and he comes and puts his paw on my leg,
oh
and then I'm
wow,
like, okay, let's pray, and the dog will pray with him.
that's
He'll sit there
amazing.
and put his head down and everything, and it's like, that's pretty awesome that a dog can be trained, to help. But he said it's been so much more easy to be a chaplain now that he's got his dog to help him.
For sure. Yeah, that's something too. I never really considered this, the side of actually taking on others' burdens, for lack of better
Hmm.
terms, but basically taking their PTSD on as well. I think, yeah, that's even on the most simple level, for anybody that's not had a traumatic situation like that. Just think about how many songs have been written about breakups.
Exactly. Yeah,
when,
we
you
wouldn't
know,
have any songs if that was the case.
you think about like when you were in school, and you had your first real relationship, and then your first breakup, and then you go in your room and listen to music.
Yeah, right. That's how
Just
you deal with it.
yeah.
Elton John's got that song Sad Songs where he says, if someone else has suffered basically like you, then it helps you. And it's like that's wisdom right there, that's the truth
That is
and how
true.
it is. I have been involved for the last almost 10 years studying the Francis Child's ballads. They so I got invited to Harvard, and I went up to study. Francis Child was the first English professor at Harvard, and he got his doctorate from Germany, and his teachers were actually the Brothers Grimm. And so
Wow.
this guy, he when he graduated, he was like, a lot of people have already done what you guys are doing in English, where they're gathering all of the fairy tales and the folklore and all that. But I want to do something like that, but it's already been done. And they said, well, why don't you collect, because he was a musician, they were like, why don't you collect the songs that have all of this folklore in them? And so that's what he did. And so he spent the rest of his life compiling all of the folk songs that were popular from Scotland and England
Wow.
at the time. And when I went to go to study at Harvard and look at the boxes, I said, can I see the child collection? They're like, well, which box do you want? And I said, well, how many boxes are there? And they're like, there are 43 boxes, and each box contains like 10 folios. And I'm like, you're telling me there's like over 4,000 books that I got to go through to study? I said, okay, well, let me start with book one,
Yeah.
and then I'll figure out what I want to do. So once I got through book one, I was like, let me just study the stuff that was rejected. And so I'm like the only person that's ever studied his rejected texts.
Interesting.
And this is a little bit of a side jump, but I'll get back to my point in a second. He basically, there were a lot of folk songs that people say, oh, Child didn't know about this folk song, or Child didn't know about that one. And I found them all. All the ones that people say he didn't know,
He
but
actually
for
did.
some reason he rejected them because they didn't fit his criteria. And so that was kind of an interesting thing. But my point was, a lot of these folk songs date back to the Middle Ages. And so they date back to the time period of when there were knights and they were in combat and all this stuff. And they deal with these subjects like way more than what, like we were talking about breakup songs or something. these are songs that they're kind of like the news of the day. So they'll be like, one of the songs is called Two Sisters, and it records a murder where one sister got jealous of the other one and pushed her into the river,
Oh,
and the
geez.
sister drowned. Another one is about like a knight who the crows have come and decided to eat him while he was on the battlefield, and it's like they're kind of gruesome, like Grimm's fairy tales in a way, but they're very real kind of situations, and they really um, make you think, okay, if you lived in a time period where your buddies, there's a good chance you might have to go out to war, and when and death is kind of a normal fact of life. Some of the songs are about women dying in childbirth. Some of the songs are about farmers, getting ran over by their cow or whatever. It's like things like this, and it's like those. And people have asked me, like, why would anybody write songs like that? Well, it's to deal with the PTSD, and so that other people know, oh, I guess our community's not the only community that had something shocking like that happen to it. I'm not the only person that had to go through a war like
Yeah.
that, or I'm not the only person who lost people in a shipwreck,
Yeah. Yeah, and it's not like, nowadays we can Google, how do I deal with this? How do I deal with
Mm-hmm.
loss? How do I deal with, you know, traumatic experience?
Yeah.
And you have plenty of resources. They didn't have Google.
Oh
That
yeah, well, and you
was
got
their way.
AI now that Chat GPT will talk you through, the stages of grief or something like that.
Yeah, truly.
But nothing like that existed back in the day. And it's the same thing with the forms. It's like I've never been good at doing forms, and that's why for me I was like, the forms drive me nuts. But the forms are there because they have encapsulated a moment of time into a ritualized dance that can then be used to, you break it apart to use it in combat.
Yeah.
And I think that the one of the things where a lot of martial arts I find, I think this is changing because of MMA, but I think up until like in the '80s, it kind of became a arguing point that, well, this martial art, all those, they're just forms and they're not teaching you how to fight, or that martial art, there's just forms and they're not teaching you how to fight. And it's like, well, that's because they weren't necessarily teaching how to adapt the form into,
Yeah.
and a lot of the schools were getting away from that.
Yeah.
But I think with the MMA, what we're seeing is people from all sorts of different martial arts backgrounds are coming into it, and they're on the fly having to adapt their system to work, against somebody from another system. And if for nothing else, it's interesting to see how a real combatant is changing their techniques, or pulling up their reserve of techniques to use them in a realistic, slightly more realistic combat situation.
Yeah, truly. It's interesting you brought that up too, because there's been, I think, a shift. Like my background is very, it's all in the Chinese martial arts, and there's such an amount of evolution that happened in just from the late 1800s up until today.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all sorts of elements that have been factors in its change and evolution. I think probably the martial arts, the way that we see Chinese martial arts today, is with the very heavily forms based, a lot of it has to do with the Cultural Revolution, and then of course following that was the there's a real term for it, I can't remember, but more or less what I like to say, the wushu revival. So wushu
Mm-hmm.
means martial arts, but nowadays if you hear wushu, you think of the performance style of
Right.
Chinese martial arts.
Jet
And
Li kind of.
yeah, exactly. So it's tournament based, it's competition based, and they tried to originally standardized the different styles of martial arts to allow people to relearn them because they found it was a big part of Chinese identity. And
Mm.
but at the same time, there was a lot that was lost in standardization from the unique techniques, tactics, and concepts. But then also, eventually, it became more and more competition based. So people started the arts evolved in that direction. However, there's still other martial arts that were still very combative based, but
Mm.
they took influences from wushu performances. And it's not to say that wushu was the only one to do this. Prior to that, there were Chinese opera, and there were like people
Right.
were taking on elements of Chinese opera performance. But that's a really long way of saying, where we tend to see where Chinese martial arts is now. But there's still a lot of solid techniques and solid combat tactics and usages. But I think when we get into the MMA years, and specifically like the UFC years,
Mm-hmm.
when you watch the original, like the very early UFC, when it was just pretty much style against style, it was just wild territory. And I think a great
Yeah.
example of adaptability came from that guy. I don't know if you remember Tank Abbott in the early
Oh
days.
yeah.
His style was just street fighting. He had
Yep.
no teeth, and he was just a really tough guy. He could endure everybody and then just bash them and then win. And I think when you watch just specifically that little, just a sample really of just the UFC years, and you watch when
Mm-hmm.
everybody was style against style, but then all of a sudden, jujitsu came in and was not really
Yeah.
going in for the hitting, and was able to submit people. And then you watch the progression of that where people wanted to work stand up and then wrestling and the grounds and ground together. And then I want to say during the tap out era, when tap out the brand was around, there was a big people found like a golden formula which worked
Mm-hmm.
really well in combat sports. You had, I mean, boxing was up there, but more or less, Muay Thai was the style for
Mm-hmm.
striking. You had to,
Yeah.
because it was your punching, your elbows, and your knees and your kicks. So that took care
Yep.
of all your striking. And then jiu-jitsu was all about your ground game. So people were just studying in both of those, and in a matter of months to a year, somebody could be very competent in
Mm-hmm.
martial arts or in combat sports just with that little golden formula. And
Yeah.
then after a while, when everybody was doing the exact same thing, you started to find these guys that were coming back with traditional backgrounds. Maybe they learned it when they were a kid, and then they got into fighting in UFC or mixed martial arts and getting into that stuff. But then all of a sudden, they started reintroducing techniques. And
Mm-hmm.
I would always laugh because you'd hear like the commentators every time, like some guy would do, you know, he would do, in his combinations, all of a sudden he does a 360 or like a 180-degree turn into a tornado kick. And then
Right.
the commentators, oh my God, I've never seen, wow, this is what, it's
Yeah.
like,
Right.
this is like a intermediate level Taekwondo technique.
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's neat to see that at some point they found that the base is solid enough that they can start introducing things from more traditional styles, and it gave a little bit more weight to what the traditional styles had. And I
Well,
think,
have
like,
you watched a lot of the memes lately where it's like, this is this is how it works in the movies, and somebody will do a traditional, like whatever, like a tornado kick or something, and then it'll be like, and this is real life, and then the guy turns around and they just kick him in the back while he's turning,
yeah,
and I'm like, I watch those and I'm like, you're this is not actual how this works.
no,
Like you don't just decide in the middle of whenever you want to throw in a tornado kick. It's like
yeah.
there's a time and a place for that tornado kick, and it's like you just wouldn't put it at that spot, you
Yeah.
know?
Yeah, so that's also an interesting thing, I guess, now where we've hit with the like meme culture as well, is that, and especially, I think we're still at a midpoint where we're going to see where martial arts end up going, and how traditional arts will evolve as well. But I think when you look at there's a really popular thing about finding frauds, finding, because there's right now we have like all this social media allows the grifters
Mm-hmm.
and the fraudsters to come out. So you get things like McDojo Life,
Oh
and
yeah.
I actually know Rob. I met him in person. We hung out, we talked, and his goal is to keep martial arts legit. And
Yeah.
he's not just out there witch hunting, which a lot of people feel like it because I mean, that's what gets the most reactions and interactions from people online. But he's actually got a lot more that he goes out towards, exposing schools that are doing fraudulent activity and on even worse levels where it comes down to how they're mistreating students and
Mm-hmm.
children and problems like
Wow.
that. But there's because of he actually has a really nice way of going about it, but there's a lot of people that go out there and they come from maybe a combat sports background and then they look at every traditional style as wrong and silly and then
Mm-hmm.
they try to look at every single move and then make fun of it and then say like, oh, this would never work like that.
Yeah, but the
So
thing is, it's like some things are. You also have to look at the thing like karate. Karate didn't exist before World War II, and then it was developed as an exercise program, and then it became a sport. Taekwondo, similar kind of a thing. And it's like, okay, if I play chess, if we sat down to play chess, there are certain rules. But if you and I decide, hey, you know what, it'd be more interesting if we added this to our game and added that to our game, then it becomes our own version of chess,
yeah,
and it adapts, and it might only work because of our personalities, um, and so in the same thing, if you're talking about a sport is a game.
yeah,
Bottom line, that's what it is. And so if you're playing a game, you're going to have rules that you follow. If you're talking about trying to train, like, say, the Green Berets or something, then you're not trying to train them with techniques from a game. You
yeah,
want to find out what the best actual, skills are for combat use.
yeah.
The other part
Context
of
is
it, too,
everything.
is Tai Chi. From what I understand about the development of Tai Chi, the whole point of it was for older people so that they could
Well,
continue to be. It was like part of the Chinese medicine system, right?
that's what it became. But
Oh, okay.
The founder of Tai Chi. So there's the founder of Yang style Tai Chi. He actually was the first one to use the term Tai Chi. He did
Okay.
learn an art from somebody else, and then he kind of modified it and taught it himself. But it's basically what we know as Tai Chi, the slow moving techniques. But he was known as a fighter, and he even had the name
Okay.
Invincible Yang. Like
Oh,
he was a
wow.
strong, yeah, and he was actually hired to teach at the imperial, like the palace, and he was teaching some princes. I don't think he taught the top royalty,
Oh,
but he was
wow.
very well known for his fighting ability. But
Well, wasn't there a doctor though? Maybe I'm confusing or conflating him with somebody down the line. There was a really well-known Chinese herbalist that I remember reading about, and he's the one that like popularized Tai Chi for older people. Do you know who I'm talking
yeah,
about?
I mean, I wouldn't say that it was just one person in particular. I
Okay.
think so. You have from that founder, his grandson was he was teaching, but his main goal was to teach people to he didn't not just old people, but everyone. He wanted to
Okay.
make Chinese people stronger, but
Okay.
he didn't have ties directly to herbalism or anything like that.
Oh no.
I think probably who you're thinking of was maybe coming out to the West. There
Oh,
could have been one of
maybe.
his students that came out and was a Chinese medicine doctor, but also kind of following that same formula because what people have found is that that slow movement works wonders for exercise. It's low impact exercise. It's mindfulness in motion.
Right.
If you're working on staying relaxed and moving and using the entire body, you're developing mobility. You're developing that connection from your hand and eye coordination and things like that. And
Okay.
people, it's more of a shift that's happened in the last 50 years plus, maybe 50, 60 years, where it's gone
Okay.
mostly towards health benefits,
Well,
because that's where it's
I
very
I've
after.
got an I've got an herb book, and I read this story. It's in one of them, and it talks about this guy's life. And he was a medical doctor, but he was also a Chinese traditional medicine doctor. And I can't remember his name. And I know I don't. I mean, I don't think he was the guy that invented, like you were saying. But I know this guy was like he really popularized its use for in medicine. But I
Yeah.
can't remember. If I remembered his name, you'd probably be like, "Oh yeah, I know who you're talking about."
Mhm.
But but what I thought was interesting when I read that part or that section in that book, and of course it's been years ago, so that's why I don't remember anything about it. But it talked about the blood flow and
Mhm.
how a lot of the stuff helps get blood flow to places where you wouldn't normally have the blood flowing. And like with broken bones in the extremities and things like that, Tai Chi's really good for getting blood to flow into those parts. And I just thought that was really fascinating. You know
Yeah, I think
that
when you look at it too, I mean, the moving slow is only one part of it.
right.
And this is, I think that's one of those things where it is really important, though. Most people's goal these days is for the health benefits of Tai Chi training. They still need to have an idea of the martial application,
Mm-hmm.
because they're, what we typically call it is just intention. And
Mm.
if you think about, like, again, if I, just to make a very simple, image of this, if you were to throw a punch and somebody has no martial arts training, they could just lift their arm up in a
That's
fist.
true.
Maybe they end up having the hand like this. The
Mm-hmm.
movement, because they're doing movement by virtue of that, there's going to be some benefit. But if they can get correct alignment, correct posture, correct elbow shoulder position, they're not going to be creating bad
Right.
things and tensing up muscles
Yeah.
incorrectly. And then also that squeeze at the end of the punch, having
Mm-hmm.
that intention, having the and just in that, even just as simple as that, squeezing the hand, causing a little more blood flow, more blood
Yeah.
circulation is beneficial. But if they have actual martial arts experience, the benefit increases even more,
Yeah.
because it's not just the arm at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Once, like, intention is taking that physical action, that physical feedback of actually hitting something. If there was a
Mm-hmm.
punching bag in front of you and you punch it, and you're used to, that same feeling, that same sensation, when you recreate it even with nothing in front of you, it's not just the arm that ends up in position. As it's moving into position, I'm already thinking of where I would have been connecting. I'm visualizing that. But now the rest of my body engages as well. And the more body
Mm.
engagement that happens, the more medical benefit is going to happen as well.
That makes sense. That's
So,
perfect sense.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
and I'm not denigrating Tai Chi at all as a martial art in general, because I remember watching a video one time of an older guy that he had been practicing Tai Chi forever, and he got mugged. It was a security footage
Hmm.
from a CCTV, and these three punks mugged this guy, and he wiped the floor with them. It's just like they learned a lesson pretty quick that just because he was old, it didn't mean anything. And of course, they asked him. I guess the police asked him afterwards. He says, "Yeah, I've been practicing Tai Chi since I was 12." You
Well, there
know.
you go.
So it's like and he was not. It was no other martial art that he was doing. You
Wow.
know. So everything about Tai Chi is combative too.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, like, the potential is there as long as it's taught and it's learned with that respect to it. But, like, I mean, we all know there's a senior center that's doing this for low impact exercise for people, and it has great benefits for that, which is why that martial art has become more of a health art. But it does
Well, and I
have.
feel like they're showing research too about how it helps combat Alzheimer's.
Yep.
And I believe the reason it does that is because it goes back to, well, we didn't talk about it in this episode, but in the one that our poor viewers can't see, we talked about it, how the ambidexterity part of switching back and forth, and really ambidexterity is not, I mean, there is a part of ambidexterity where you're doing the different things with the same hands, but a lot of times it's really just the speed at which you're switching from hand to hand. And when you're doing that, that's opening up synapses in your brain, causing your brain to function in a way that it just sitting in a chair is not going to allow that to happen. And the sad thing is, I remember as a kid going to visit relatives in the nursing homes, and that was their life. They just sat there in a chair and they progressively got worse. But if you can remain active somehow, even if it's slowly, where you're engaging the left side and then the right side and then the left side again, and then maybe switch it up and then the left side and then the right side, where you're alternating it and making it not the same thing. And I think last time too you mentioned just the mere fact of practicing like different hand positions and focusing on what the hand position is doing and how to form it properly, and then switching to another hand position, that's going to engage your brain as you're switching back and forth that you wouldn't normally get if you were just sitting there.
Yeah.
And I think that that's why I think diet has a lot to do with Alzheimer's we're seeing, but I also think the whole exercise aspect and engaging both sides of the brain is and the brain, from what I've been reading lately, I read an article just a week or two ago about how the brain is almost the one part of the body that if you treat it well, it pretty much would last forever.
Wow.
It's
No
just
kidding.
it's the rest of your body that breaks down,
Yeah. Yeah.
but we put crap into our brain like sugar and chemicals and all sorts of stuff that if we weren't putting that in there. Now I don't know how true that article is, because I'm sure there's got to be some entropy even to the brain, but I do see their point. If you're filling your brain with all sorts of garbage, you're probably causing it to be damaged more. And really, it seems like something like Alzheimer's is just the long-term residual effects of polluting the brain.
Hmm.
You know.
Yeah, that is interesting. I, it. I think also, actually, to go back on Tai Chi on this, I think that's one of those one of the nice benefits of doing something like Tai Chi and actually doing a forms based art in respect to just getting older and staying healthy is not only do you have these movements that you have your mobility, you're working the range of motion, but when you're doing forms and you have you're always working your memory. You're doing direction changes. You're facing different ways. You do, like, there's a in the style that I teach and the style that I practice. There's one form that's 108 movements long, and it's not just counting like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 like that. That whole sequence is just counted as one move. So it's 108
wow. Of
techniques.
those combinations.
Some are longer combinations like that. Some are a little bit shorter. It's just a single position, but it is 108. And if you were to count single movements, it would be somewhere. I wouldn't doubt it would be in the 200s.
Well,
So
and I can see that would be really good for your brain too, because you're engaging the idea of memorization
yeah,
in there as well.
and
Because you've got to say, well, which order does this go in? Do I do this first or do I do that first?
yeah, oh yeah. And there's
That's
repetition
interesting.
within that too, so you have to be paying attention because
Let me
you
let me
might do
ask
a
you.
combination where you're moving by, and then this time you're going to step out and do this move, but maybe the next time you're going to raise up and go on one leg, or you're going to drop down low and do another move. So you have to be aware, like, oh, at this part of the form, I got to do this. At this part of the form, I got to do that.
When you learned Tai Chi, did you learn it separately from Kung Fu, or was it
Yes.
part of the same? Okay,
So it
so
was in the same school, but we always made sure the arts were taught separately.
is it the same kind of restriction on what you're allowed to show with Tai Chi?
Not as much on certain things, yes, but on the standard, because there's a lot of like the style that I do is very popular. So there's a bunch
Okay,
of people already out there that
that
have
are doing that
shown
style.
videos of entire forms and stuff.
Okay,
So that's not too big.
that's interesting.
Yeah.
I want to go back to the big guy tank that you mentioned earlier. Um, and muscle development. And that's another thing that as I'm getting older, I'm like, it feels like when I go to the gym, I have to do way more to keep the muscle that I do have. Um, it seems to me that there. I remember my uncle telling me he was a Marine and he was an MP, and he said one time they had to go arrest this guy who was drunk, out in the town. I think it was in Okinawa, and he said this guy was so big it took like 5 Marines to take him down, and they put handcuffs on him, and the guy just goes, and he popped the handcuffs, and he went back to fighting everybody. And there's there is something to be said about just being massive and fighting, but everybody's like, you know, I guess. Well, how do I want to say this? As a martial artist, you have to fight with your brain first before you engage with your muscles, and it's kind of like, what would you say to the big guys out there that they're not afraid or they just laugh at the martial artists? What would you say to kind of give them a little bit more education, about what they might actually run up against?
I guess I wouldn't necessarily put it in consequence for them, like what to worry about in other people that they refine their training, but just simply to put it as, like if you're strong, why not make yourself stronger? Why not make
Oh, there
yourself
you
more
go. Yeah.
capable? Why not make yourself more coordinated? Because clearly you can get by with just brute force, but what happened, you can work maybe even more stamina out of this. What happens if you run
Hmm.
into somebody that is more your size? I mean, that can take as much as you
Yeah.
take. Then it comes down to gassing out. Are you gonna have the stamina to stay through? There's ways to make yourself better and make yourself more efficient. And I think actually
Yeah.
that's a great way to kind of tie in, going way back to the beginning when we were talking about speed, because
Yeah.
speed is not necessarily something where you can just make yourself go faster. It's a lot of it comes down to trimming down a lot of extra and unnecessary movement,
That's
unnecessary
true.
muscle engagement, and being able to make yourself to change your timing so that you're able to react at a faster pace. Not the speed of it, but just being able to be there at that time. And I
Hmm.
think, when you're looking at, like, I'm going to use a lot of punches this time, but if we're looking at a 1-2 combination, it, from this very first punch, when this one hits, I don't need to wait for this hand to come back, and then I don't need to pull this hand back before throwing it out. Just being
Right.
able to, as soon as this one's coming back, to
It's
set that other
coming
one
back.
up,
Yeah.
engage the correct muscles, not doing that gas and brakes kind of a thing. And then
Yep.
that comes through a lot of repetition, is becoming more familiar and more smooth.
Yeah. And
But
that's where your forms come in, because the forms teach you the fluidity of one hand being followed by the other, whereas otherwise you're just I made this movement. Okay, now I'm making that movement. And it's like that's wasting a lot of energy.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And then also, I think too, when it comes down to speed, the problem is the transmission of energy, the power that actually
Mm-hmm.
lands. Sometimes people think so much on trying to get to this handout that by the time this one reaches out, they pull it back too soon so they can get the other hand
That's
out, and
true.
it's not a substantial strike.
Yeah, not a real punch. And I think that's one of the things that I like to when like when in FMA with my students, a lot of times I like to have them actually do drills where they're actually hitting each other's sticks.
Mm-hmm.
So that way they're feeling this is what it's like to land a hit.
Yeah.
If you're by yourself and you're just going, and you're going through the heaven six motions, well, you don't know what it feels like when your stick actually hits against something. And so a lot of times we'll have a tire that we'll put up like a tire swing, and we'll hit the tire, and the tire swing will actually start moving. So it's kind of like now I got to move to react to what the tire is doing, and that's a person's going to be moving too. And so it's kind of like when you're feeling that impact, that's teaching you something too. Whereas it's
100%.
not just about the movement. And I found when I was in Kuttel One, it got to a point we didn't do as much sparring as in other martial arts, and it felt to me like a lot of the techniques that I learned in Kuksul I never really felt or understood what they felt like against another person, and it's like I think that it's really important that people get the full feeling of what it's like to connect, because you don't want to just go and slap somebody. If you're in that situation, you got to make sure that each punch counts. But that's the other thing too, that I like studying vital strike points. Whether they're pressure points or whether they're just, places to dislocate a bone or something like that. And I'm always telling my wife, if we watch like a movie and somebody does I'm like, wait a minute, and I'll pause. I'll be like, that wouldn't work. If you're ever in this situation, this is how you need to address that or whatever. And my wife, I don't know how much of this she actually retains, but it's like, I don't know. And the thing is, it's like when I was in, this is sad, when I was in college, one of my friends from high school was raped and murdered. And so now it's like whenever I talk to girls, especially, I'm like, look, this will help you. This is one little thing you can do to keep yourself more safe. And it's like I'm really conscious about telling women, you know, little techniques, just little snippets of things that might help them. Like for one, I'm always telling my wife, hold your keys, out your fingers when you're walking through a dark parking lot, because if somebody comes for your purse, you can always come across and get them across the face. And then the police can recognize it's not necessarily about hurting the person. It's about leaving a mark that the police can recognize when they go back to catch the person. And it's like little things like that I'm always telling my students and people that I know, because for me, it's real. It's a life and death thing that I know has happened, to somebody that I knew.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of like I want to pass that on as much as I can. And that goes back to what we were talking about, the YouTube thing. You have no idea if some technique you taught on YouTube saves some girl's life or somebody's life, from being mugged or whatever. And it's like that right there in and of itself should be enough to convince people, hey, it's important, to have YouTube channels like this.
Yeah, and again, it kind of that's the only thing is to just be careful of the grifters that are coming up with their own versions of movie techniques and things.
Well, one of the things I've noticed, I saw a meme the other day where it was talking about when you land a punch, make sure you hit with these two fingers first. And I was like, dude, that's called the boxer's break. Like when you ask any nurse and they'll say, yeah, those are the two fingers that break the quickest. And it's like you never punch somebody with those two fingers. It's like, and why somebody would put that kind of information out there on the internet? It's like they're obviously just a jerk that knows that that's gonna hurt somebody.
I think recently one of the worst ones that I saw was like as a choke defense, somebody had the arm wrapped around and they said, "Oh, all you need to do is just push your chin down." And there is a pressure point in the elbow that
Yeah,
I
but
mean,
you got to hit that pressure point.
I mean, with your
But the
chin.
other thing too, you also have the button right there.
Yeah.
So if you're trying to do that with your chin, you might accidentally knock yourself out too. And
But
it's like,
But even in that, I mean, all you need to defend against that is just to flex your arm. Like you will have a defense against that pressure point if you're flexed. And if somebody's trying to choke you, they don't have a relaxed arm. Unless it's like just, oh yeah, you know, I put your arm, you know, if they're teaching somebody how to put my arm here, and you go down, if they're in a relaxed environment, it will work potentially. I'm not even gonna say like it will work, but like that was
my advice.
Choking yourself too.
Yeah, my advice on that is if you have somebody coming and you are going to dip your head down, why would you try to push with your chin when you could just bite them? It's like that would be
what was his name? He also taught Jeet Kune Do. He was from the Bruce Lee era. He was one of Bruce Lee's students. I can't remember his name. Interesting guy. He had some videos out where he showed biting as an option. And he even took like a chunk of wetsuit and he put a piece of meat in there. He was talking about biting with the molar. Don't bite with your teeth. Those will come out. But bite on the side here. Use your canines. And he ripped through a t-shirt. He ripped through like a wetsuit and spit out a chunk of meat. And it's like, wow, that paints the picture for sure. But
well, and guess what? You do that to somebody that's trying to put a choke on you, and they're going to give up real quick.
Yeah, for sure.
You know?
But yeah, I mean, if anything, if you're going to do anything with your chin, protect your windpipe.
Exactly. Get your windpipe protected.
Don't stick your chin out just so you can try to pressure point them.
Because they're just going to tighten up on you. There's a lot of really bad information on martial arts online. And I guess that's the double-edged sword about the whole thing. But here's the thing. Be logical.
Yeah,
Just think through what you're looking at. If you're looking at something and you logically say, well, yeah, but what about this? That's what you want. The what about this is your red flag. That's the thing that's like letting you know, okay, maybe think about this a little more. Before you spend hours and hours practicing something that's going to get you hurt, you know?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, and that's the other thing, though, too. I think when people use online resources, too, for learning self-defense, it is important that you do put in the time to practice, because just watching it and looking at it and being like, oh,
you're not going to remember.
It's never going to work. Yeah. You have to...
Your recall of bringing back a technique is only going to be, if you don't practice it, you might remember the end or the beginning, but you're not going to remember the intermediate connectivity of the whole thing unless you actually practice each step. And I would bring up some advice that I teach my students reading sheet music. Work from the back to the front. Like, go ahead and work through it from the front to the back several times, but then say, okay, well, there's this one spot that I'm always getting hung up on. Go to the technique right behind it, and then work backwards, and then go to the end, and then go to the next one, and work to the end, and go to the next one, and just keep working back until you've smoothed that part that you're having trouble with out. And once you've done that, then the whole thing's going to work a lot more fluidly that way. And that works great with sheet music, and there's something about it. It makes your brain actually process each individual part in a different way than if you're just going from the front to the end.
That makes a lot of sense.
Well, Sifu, I better let you go. We've been talking for a while, but I would love to talk to you again sometime.
Absolutely.
And I'm so happy I can see that everything recorded well. So I will have this one edited, and I will let you know when it's up, and maybe we'll talk again sometime.
That sounds good. That sounds good.